Caleb Vance hadn't meant to buy anything. The dimly lit market on the fringes of Vega 7 was the kind of place where relics were more stolen than sold, but something about the ring caught his attention. It wasn't flashy, just a smooth, dark band with faint etchings that reminded him of ancient runes. The trader, a wiry old man with cybernetic fingers, smirked as he slid it into Caleb's palm. "Yours for a steal," the trader murmured. "Rare artifact, older than this system." Caleb hesitated. He'd handled countless artifacts, verified their authenticity, exposed frauds. But this ring felt different, warmer than it should be. The etchings pulsed ever so faintly under his fingertips. He should have questioned it, should have walked away. Instead, he paid the man and slipped the ring onto his finger. The moment it clicked into place, pain lanced through his body like a current. The market around him blurred. A rush of heat, then cold, then a presence. Not just any presence, someone else inside his mind. Before he could react, a blinding blue light erupted in front of him, scattering the crowd. A figure emerged, moving like a force of nature, her long sapphire hair whipping around her as violet eyes locked onto him. The intensity in them sent a chill down his spine. The woman, no, not a woman, something more, raised a hand and the air thrummed. "You," she hissed. "What have you done?" Caleb stumbled back, his pulse hammering. The pressure in his chest grew unbearable, like something inside him was stretching, shifting. His breath caught. The ring, it wasn't just an artifact, it had bound him. A streak of light shot past his ear as energy fire rained down from above. Bounty hunters, armed and closing in. The blue-haired stranger swore under her breath and lunged, grabbing Caleb's wrist. The moment her fingers closed around his skin, a jolt raced through him. Not painful, but deep, anchoring like gravity had suddenly increased tenfold. "You activated it." Her voice was low, furious. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" "I didn't." Caleb barely had time to protest before she yanked him into motion. They weaved through the chaos of the marketplace as shouts rang out behind them. Another shot barely missed his shoulder. "Who are they?" he shouted. "They're after you," she shot back. "And by extension, me." Caleb's mind raced as they ducked into a narrow alley, pressed against the metallic wall, breath shallow. The glow of her eyes dimmed slightly as she assessed him, as if she were scanning his very soul. "You bound us," she said at last. "That ring is a marriage sigil of my people." Caleb blinked. "Excuse me," she exhaled sharply. "It's not a simple relic, it's an ancient bond." And now, she held up her hand. A matching sigil, faint and glowing, shimmered on her palm. The realization settled over him like a weight. He had purchased an artifact, slipped it on, and in doing so he had married an alien warrior. The universe had a cruel sense of humor. Caleb's pulse thundered in his ears. Married to an alien. He opened his mouth to protest, to demand an explanation, but the look in Seris' eyes silenced him. It wasn't just anger. It was something deeper, something cold and controlled, like she was holding back a storm of emotions. From outside the alley, the sound of boots striking metal echoed closer. The bounty hunters weren't giving up. Seris swore under her breath, then turned to him with sharp efficiency. "We can argue later," she muttered. "For now, we run." She grabbed his wrist again, and Caleb nearly tripped as an overwhelming sensation washed over him. It was unlike anything he'd felt before. Not pain, not dizziness, but connection. For a fraction of a second he was aware of her, her pulse, her breath, the tension coiling in her muscles. A flicker of frustration, of urgency, of something dangerously close to panic. Then the moment passed, and she was already moving. They sprinted through the labyrinth of back alleys, dodging between crates and flickering neon signs. Caleb's mind reeled, but his instincts kicked in. Years of digging through ruins, evading corrupt officials, and talking his way out of trouble had honed his survival skills. At a split in the path, Seris hesitated for just a moment, just long enough for Caleb to yank her toward the left passage. "This way." She threw him an unreadable look but followed without question. Moments later, an energy blast struck the wall behind them, scorching the metal. Seris gritted her teeth. "They have a tracker on you. They won't stop." Caleb barely managed to dodge another shot. "Well, I'd take the ring off, but I have a feeling that won't work." "It won't." Seris suddenly skidded to a stop, eyes scanning the surroundings. "But we can break their lock." She grabbed his hand, the one with the ring, and pressed it against the wall of a nearby control panel. The moment her fingers touched his skin, that pulse of shared awareness hit again. This time, Caleb was ready for it. A surge of heat ran through him, and he swore he could feel the hum of her thoughts. "Focus." He took a breath and did as she said. The panel blinked to life. Sarah's other hand hovered over the interface, her bioluminescent hair glowing faintly as she whispered in a language Caleb couldn't understand. A second later, the market's security grid overloaded. Lights flickered, alarms blared, and the air crackled with disrupted signals. Caleb felt the weight in his chest lift slightly. Whatever tracking system the bounty hunters were using had just been fried. Seris pulled him back into motion. "That will slow them down, but not for long." They emerged onto a landing bay where a sleek, dark-hulled ship was docked. Seris sprinted toward it, barely out of breath. Caleb, however, was gasping. She turned, watching him struggle to keep up. "You're slower than I expected." Caleb scowled. "Forgive me for not being a genetically superior space warrior." Despite the situation, the corner of her mouth twitched, just barely. It was gone in an instant, replaced by her usual unreadable expression, but Caleb caught it. They reached the ship, and Seris waved a hand over the access panel. The hatch hissed open. She shoved him inside just as distant voices shouted from the other end of the landing bay. The moment they were in, the hatch sealed. Seris strode toward the cockpit without hesitation. Caleb leaned against a wall, catching his breath. "So, this bond, you sure it's real?" She shot him a look over her shoulder. "Feel for yourself." He was about to argue when he suddenly became hyper-aware of something that wasn't his own thought. A faint hum at the back of his mind, like a second heartbeat, like a presence he couldn't shake. It was real. His stomach twisted. "And how exactly do we break it?" Seris didn't answer. Caleb pushed off the wall, stepping closer. "That is the plan, right? Undo whatever this is." This time she hesitated, just for a moment. But it was enough. The ship rumbled beneath them as Seris started the thrusters. "We find an ancient archive on Jevier 4, she said at last. "There are records there, ones that might explain how to reverse the bond." "Might." Her fingers tightened on the controls. "This kind of bond isn't meant to be broken." Caleb exhaled. Of course it wasn't. Because why would anything ever be easy? As the ship lifted off, he stared down at the ring on his finger, its symbols glowing softly in the dim light. It had seemed so simple when he bought it. Now, it might change his life forever. The ship soared into the vast expanse of space, leaving the chaos of Vega 7 behind. Caleb leaned against the co-pilot's seat, watching the swirling nebulae stretch across the viewport. The hum of the engines vibrated through his bones, but his mind was locked on a single thought. The bond was real. He could feel Seris, not just her presence, but subtle things, her pulse steadying after the chase, the way her breathing shifted as she focused on the controls. It wasn't invasive, not yet, but it was enough to make his skin prickle. She hadn't spoken since takeoff. "All right," Caleb said finally, breaking the silence. "I think I deserve some answers." Seris didn't look at him. "I already told you." "Yeah, you told me I accidentally bound myself in an alien marriage contract. But let's get into the details, shall we?" He gestured to the ring. "How does this thing even work?" Seris exhaled, rubbing her temples as if she too was feeling the weight of his presence in her mind. "It's not just a symbol. It's an ancient sigil of my people, created long before our civilization fell. It binds two souls, ensuring they remain connected through thought, emotion, and, eventually, life force." Caleb's stomach turned. Eventually, she hesitated. His fingers curled. Seris. Her violet eyes flicked toward him, wary. If the bond isn't broken in time, it becomes permanent. Your fate and mine will be linked. Linked how? Her expression hardened. If you die, I die. The words hit him like a punch to the chest. Caleb stared at the ring, the etchings pulsing faintly. He never should have put it on. A long, tense silence stretched between them. Then he let out a sharp laugh, running a hand down his face. So, just to recap, I bought a ring, put it on, and now I'm permanently tied to an alien stranger, who, by the way, might actually die if I screw up. Seris' gaze darkened. You think I wanted this? Well, considering you just saved my life back there, I'd say you're at least a little invested in keeping me alive. Her jaw tightened. Only because I have no choice. The words stung more than they should have. Caleb folded his arms. Great. So we're both stuck in this mess. What happens if we do break the bond? Seris hesitated again. He caught it. What aren't you telling me? Her grip on the control panel was rigid. Severing a bond like this isn't simple. It would erase all traces of the connection, including any memories we have of each other. Caleb's breath caught. Forget everything. His fingers drifted toward the ring. He could still feel the faint hum of her presence, like an echo in the back of his mind. The idea of cutting that off, of wiping it clean like they had never met, he swallowed hard. Well, that's one hell of a divorce settlement. Seris didn't laugh. Instead, she turned away, her bioluminescent hair shifting like liquid silk. We should rest. Sever 4 is 2 cycles away. That was the end of the conversation. Caleb sat back, staring out at the void of space. He should have been relieved. If they reached Sever 4, they could fix this. He could go back to his normal life. So why did the thought sit like a rock in his gut? The ship's cabin was dim, save for the faint glow of control panels. Caleb lay on one of the small bunks, staring at the ceiling. Sleep wouldn't come. His thoughts were tangled, restless. He felt her. It wasn't intrusive, but it was there. A soft awareness of her presence in the other room. Her heartbeat was slower now, resting but not fully asleep. The bond was growing. He exhaled, rubbing his hands over his face. This was insane. He was supposed to be an archaeologist, a historian, not some unwilling participant in an alien ritual. A flicker of movement drew his attention. Seris stood in the doorway, arms crossed, watching him with unreadable violet eyes. You're awake. So are you. She hesitated, then stepped forward. I can feel your restlessness. The admission sent a shiver through him. Caleb sat up. I won't pretend I understand this whole bond thing, but I get the sense that it's not just a one-way street. Seris didn't move, but something in her expression shifted, just barely. He tilted his head. You feel it too, don't you? A long pause. Then finally she nodded. It was the first honest moment they had shared. The weight in Caleb's chest deepened. Neither of them spoke after that. But the silence wasn't empty. It was something else entirely. The hum of the ship was steady, but the silence between them held weight. Caleb and Seris stood there, neither willing to break whatever this was. The awareness of each other had settled into something unshakable. It wasn't just a passing feeling anymore. It was real. Seris was the first to move. She exhaled softly and sat on the bunk across from him, her expression carefully guarded. Caleb studied her, noticing the way her hands flexed slightly, like she was trying to shake off a tension she wouldn't admit to. This connection, Caleb finally said, voice quieter than he expected. How deep does it go? Seris didn't look at him. Instead, she stared at her own hand, at the faint glow of the sigil on her palm. At first it's just presence, awareness. Her fingers twitched. Then it strengthens. Thoughts become easier to sense. Emotions. Her jaw tightened. They start to bleed through. Caleb's stomach dipped. So you can feel. Not yet, she interrupted quickly. But it's building. The words sent a cold ripple down his spine. The idea of anyone, having that kind of access to him, to his thoughts, his emotions, it was terrifying. He had spent most of his life keeping walls up, pushing people away before they could get close enough to hurt him. And now he was tethered to someone he barely knew, someone who had no choice but to be bound to him. His fingers ran over the ring absently. This has to be a nightmare. Seris gave a humorless smile. If it is, then we're both trapped in it. The weight in his chest pressed down harder. He didn't want this. She didn't want this. But neither of them had a say in the matter. Caleb rubbed the back of his neck, forcing himself to think logically. All right. Let's say we make it to Sever 4, and let's say we do find a way to break this thing. What happens then? Seris hesitated. Caleb frowned. Seris. Her fingers curled into her palm. If we succeed, we will be unbound. But the connection, every moment, every memory, will be erased. The words hit him harder than he expected. He let out a slow breath. So we'd be strangers again. Seris nodded once. Caleb stared at the ring. It still pulsed softly, faint but steady, as if reminding him that he wasn't alone. He should have been relieved. But for some reason, the thought of forgetting, of losing these moments, no matter how unwanted they had been at first, made something in his chest twist uncomfortably. Seris shifted slightly. I can feel your hesitation. Caleb's jaw tensed. I don't like losing things. She finally met his gaze. Neither do I. It was the closest thing to an admission she had given. They sat there, neither saying another word, but both knowing that something between them had changed. Sever 4 loomed ahead, a planet of vast ruins and ancient knowledge. As the ship descended, Caleb felt the unease settle deep in his stomach. Seris was tense too. He didn't need the bond to tell him that. Her posture was rigid, her fingers drumming lightly against her leg. A nervous tick, he realized. As they landed, she glanced at him. Stay close. We don't know what we'll find here. Caleb smirked faintly. Oh, don't worry. I'm not exactly looking to get lost on an alien ruined planet. The air was thick with energy as they stepped out, the ruins stretching in eerie silence. The structures were massive, carved with symbols that felt familiar, even though Caleb had never seen them before, or had he? A strange sensation washed over him, recognition. Seris stiffened. You feel it too, Caleb swallowed. Why do I know these symbols? She didn't answer. Instead, she stepped forward, guiding them deeper into the ruins. The answers were waiting, and something told Caleb that neither of them was ready for what they would find. The ruins of Sever 4 loomed around them, ancient and still, as if time itself had forgotten this place. The air felt charged, thick with something Caleb couldn't name. Every step he took, every line of alien script he saw sent a ripple through him, like his mind was grasping at something just out of reach. Seris walked ahead, her movements precise, almost reverent. The glow from her bioluminescent hair pulsed faintly, reacting to the latent energy in the ruins. Caleb watched as she traced her fingers along the carved walls, murmuring words he didn't understand. Then suddenly she froze. What? Caleb asked, stepping closer. Seris' violet eyes locked onto him. This place is responding to you. Caleb frowned. What do you mean? She gestured toward the carvings. He looked and felt his breath hitch. The script was shifting. The symbols that had once been unfamiliar were realigning themselves, reshaping into something legible. Not just legible, readable by him. Caleb's pulse quickened. This doesn't make sense. Seris' expression was unreadable. Read it. His throat felt dry. Slowly, hesitantly, he traced his fingers over the inscriptions and whispered the words aloud. The bond is forged. The bond is chosen. The bond is eternal. A pulse of energy rippled outward from the walls. Caleb stumbled back, his vision flickering. For a moment, he wasn't in the ruins anymore. He was somewhere else, someone else. He saw a figure, a man, wearing the same ring he now wore. A woman stood beside him, her eyes glowing with the same soft violet as Seris. They weren't just strangers. They were connected, bound. Then the vision snapped away, leaving Caleb gasping. Seris was at his side instantly, gripping his arms. Caleb, What did you see? He shook his head, trying to steady himself. I don't know. A memory. Someone else, someone from, he exhaled sharply. From your people. Seris' grip on him tightened. That shouldn't be possible, and yet it had happened. Caleb's mind spun. This bond, this sigil, it's more than just a connection, isn't it? Seris hesitated. Then, very softly, she said, it was never meant to be broken. The words sent a cold shudder through him. Before he could respond, a distant rumble shook the ground beneath them. The ruins groaned, ancient mechanisms shifting to life. The temple wasn't just a library of knowledge, it was a test. Seris swore under her breath. We need to move. Caleb barely had time to nod before the floor beneath them collapsed. They fell into darkness. Pain flared through Caleb's body as he hit the stone floor below. Dust filled his lungs. He coughed, pushing himself up, his ears ringing. A groan to his left, Seris. She was already moving, shaking off the impact far better than he had. You all right? He rasped. She nodded, though she winced slightly as she stood. The temple defenses have activated. Caleb barely had time to process that before the walls began to shift again. Torches, real torches, flickered to life, casting long shadows as carvings rearranged themselves. A deep, resonant voice, not their own, echoed through the chamber. Those who forge the bond must prove their choice. Caleb's chest tightened. I don't like the sound of that. Seris' fingers twitched toward the weapon at her hip. Neither do I. Then the ground shook again, and something massive stirred in the darkness. Caleb turned just in time to see a guardian construct, a towering, metallic figure with glowing blue eyes, step forward. Its gaze locked onto them, and in a voice far too knowing it spoke, chosen or broken, decide. And then it attacked. The guardian construct moved faster than anything that size had a right to. Caleb barely had time to dive aside before a massive arm smashed into the stone floor where he'd just been standing. The impact sent a shockwave through the chamber, and dust rained from the ceiling. Seris had already drawn her weapon, a sleek, silver blade humming with energy. She moved with inhuman precision, sidestepping the construct's next strike and slashing at its arm. Sparks flew, but the thing barely flinched. Caleb scrambled to his feet, trying to assess the situation. I don't suppose there's a manual for this thing. Seris didn't take her eyes off the enemy. It's a trial, he cursed under his breath. Great, and what exactly are we proving? She blocked another blow, then spun away. That the bond is real. Caleb's stomach twisted, chosen or broken. Decide. The trial wasn't just about fighting, it was about them. Seris seemed to realize it at the same moment. Her grip on her blade tightened and she took a steady breath. We have to fight it together. Caleb's heart pounded. He had no weapon, no combat training that could match whatever she was capable of. But he wasn't useless. The carvings on the walls had moved for him. He turned his gaze toward the shifting inscriptions, scanning for anything that might help. The symbols blurred and shifted under his focus until a single phrase stood out. He didn't know how he knew what it said, but the meaning burned into his mind. Only through unity may the bond endure. Seris, he shouted. We have to synchronize. She dodged another blow. Explain. Caleb didn't have time for a full lecture. Instead, he did something reckless. He reached through the bond. It was like stepping into a current for a heartbeat. He felt her, truly felt her. The speed of her thoughts, the way she anticipated attacks, the precision in every movement. And she, in turn, must have felt him, his instincts, his understanding of patterns, the way his mind worked through puzzles. She gasped, just barely missing a strike. What? No time, he growled. Just trust me. Seris hesitated, then let go. The shift was instant. Caleb felt her awareness settle into him, and suddenly, he knew where the construct would strike before it even moved. He dove left, just as Seris did the same. The Guardian's massive fist crashed into empty air. They moved in tandem, their bodies reacting to an invisible rhythm neither had practiced but felt as if they had. When the construct struck again, Seris didn't just block. She redirected the force, twisting her blade in a way that Caleb guided. It was seamless. The Guardian hesitated. For the first time since it had awoken, Caleb saw something new in its glowing eyes. Recognition. This was the trial, not combat, not survival, connection. Caleb's breath came fast. Seris, she understood before he even spoke. With one last movement they turned together, and Caleb placed his hand against the construct's chest just as Seris struck its core. A blinding light filled the chamber. The Guardian froze. Then slowly it knelt. A deep, rumbling voice echoed through the walls. Bond acknowledged. The weight of the moment hit Caleb all at once. This wasn't just a test, it was a choice, and they had just chosen each other. The chamber's energy pulsed around them, the inscriptions settling. The construct slowly stood and stepped aside. The path forward was clear. Seris sheathed her blade, her breath unsteady. She turned to Caleb, and for the first time there was no distance in her expression, no cold detachment. "You reached through the bond," she said softly. He nodded. "And you didn't push me away." Seris held his gaze. A silent understanding passed between them. Then, without another word, they walked forward together. The chamber beyond the Guardian was bathed in a dim, ethereal glow, the ancient carvings along the walls pulsating like a heartbeat. The bond between them still hummed with the same resonance they had felt during the battle, an awareness neither of them could deny. Every step Caleb took, he felt Seris beside him, not just physically but through the connection. He had spent his life avoiding attachments. But this wasn't something he could run from. At the heart of the chamber stood a pedestal, a crystalline structure rising from the floor like frozen fire. Symbols glowed along its surface, shifting as if responding to them. Seris approached first, reaching out hesitantly. Her fingertips hovered over the light, and for the first time since they met, Caleb saw something close to uncertainty in her expression. He stepped beside her. "This is it, isn't it?" she nodded, though her jaw was tight. "The bond can be severed here." The words hit harder than he expected. For days, all he had wanted was to undo this mistake, to fix whatever had gone wrong and get his life back. But now, his fingers curled. The thought of losing her, made his chest ache in a way that had nothing to do with the bond. Seris exhaled slowly. "Once we activate it, the bond will break. Our memories of each other, of all of this, will fade." Caleb swallowed hard. "Are you sure that's what you want?" She finally looked at him, and for the first time he felt her hesitation as much as he saw it. He already knew the answer. The connection they had forged wasn't just some cosmic accident. It had been tested, forged in fire. They had chosen each other. Seris' hand dropped from the pedestal. She closed her eyes, exhaling softly, and when she spoke, it wasn't with the same cold detachment she had always held on to. "I don't want to forget you." The admission sent a jolt through him. Caleb stepped closer. "Then we don't break it." Her breath caught. "You'd choose this, me." It wasn't even a question anymore. He reached for her hand, fingers brushing against hers, and the bond surged. It wasn't just presence anymore. It was understanding, warmth, something that ran deeper than words. The pedestal pulsed, as if waiting for their decision. Seris squeezed his hand. Together they stepped back, away from the choice to sever. The chamber rumbled, the energy in the air shifting, not in warning but in acceptance. They had chosen to keep the bond, to keep each other. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Caleb Vance wasn't afraid. The moment they stepped away from the pedestal, the entire chamber reacted. The pulsing energy around them shifted, no longer humming with the tension of an impending severance, but with recognition, as if the ruins themselves acknowledged their choice. Seris let out a slow breath, her fingers still curled around Caleb's. She hadn't let go, neither had he. The symbols on the walls shifted, reforming into new inscriptions. Caleb's vision swam for a second, then suddenly he understood them. The bond was growing stronger, weaving into something far more permanent, Two who walk the path must choose freely. Two who remain must stand together. Seris exhaled, glancing at him. We just did something irreversible, didn't we? Caleb's lips twitched. If we didn't, I think the ancient glowing walls would be a lot more disappointed. A soft laugh. It was brief but real. The sound warmed him. Before he could say anything else, the temple trembled again. But this time, it wasn't just the chamber reacting to their choice. It was something else. Sarah's head snapped up. That wasn't the ruins. Caleb's instinct screamed a warning. They weren't alone anymore. A deep, mechanical thrum echoed through the corridors. Then a voice, low, familiar, and utterly predatory. I had a feeling you'd make that choice. Caleb's blood ran cold. From the far end of the chamber, stepping through the swirling dust, was Reek Sargon. His armor gleamed under the flickering lights, the deep etchings along its surface pulsing with energy. Behind him, a squad of mercenaries fanned out, weapons primed. Seris immediately stepped in front of Caleb, her body taut, muscles coiled. The shift between warmth and deadly efficiency was instant. You shouldn't be here, she said, voice low, dangerous. Reek smirked. Oh, but I should. See, the bond wasn't the only thing we were tracking. His gaze flickered to Caleb, eyes glinting with amusement. You, human. You're something of an anomaly now, aren't you? Caleb clenched his jaw. Reek continued, circling slightly, keeping them both in sight. Your connection to this place, your ability to read the sigils, that wasn't a coincidence. He tilted his head. And now, you've just locked that power in permanently. Caleb stiffened. He hadn't thought about that. What exactly had they just bound themselves to? Seris shifted beside him, her grip tightening on her weapon. We're leaving. Reek's smirk deepened. Are you? The air crackled. Then the mercenaries fired. Seris moved first, grabbing Caleb and pulling him into motion just as the first barrage struck the stone floor. Energy blasts ricocheted off the ancient walls, filling the chamber with smoke and sparks. Caleb didn't have time to think. He just ran. Seris returned fire, her blade humming as she deflected shots with impossible precision. But they were outnumbered, and Reek wasn't just some thug. He was a warlord, a strategist. He had been waiting for this. Caleb's mind raced. They couldn't win in a straight fight, but this wasn't just a battlefield. It was a temple, an ancient structure tied to the bond they had just chosen. He grabbed Seris' arm as they ducked behind a collapsed pillar. We need to use this place against them. She gave him a sharp look. How? Caleb didn't know yet, but the bond did. He closed his eyes, reaching through the connection. For a moment, all he felt was the chaos, the heat of Seris' focus, the pressure of their enemies closing in. But beneath that, deeper, there was something else, a response. The temple was listening. Caleb's eyes snapped open. He turned, spotting a series of intricate carvings along the far wall. His mind pieced it together before he even realized what he was doing. Get them to the center of the chamber, he said quickly. Seris didn't hesitate. That was the thing about trust. It had already been forged in fire. She launched forward, drawing fire as she moved with deadly grace. Reek barked orders, but he didn't realize what was happening until it was too late. Caleb reached the carvings and pressed his hand to the sigil. The temple responded. A pulse of energy shot through the chamber. The inscriptions flared, and suddenly, the entire room shifted. Walls closed in, corridors rearranged, and in an instant, Reek and his mercenaries were separated from each other. Seris wasted no time. She lunged at Reek, their blades clashing in a blur of silver and energy. Sparks flew as they fought, each movement calculated, precise. Caleb's heart pounded as he tried to stay one step ahead of the temple's shifting mechanisms. He didn't know how he understood them, only that he did. Reek snarled, realizing the battle had turned. His mercenaries were cut off, his advantage lost. Then he did something Caleb didn't expect. He grabbed Seris by the wrist and yanked her bond mark into contact with his own armor, which pulsed with stolen energy. Seris gasped, not in pain but in something far worse. Caleb felt it instantly. It was like his body had been ripped apart from the inside. A sudden, violent tear in the bond. His knees buckled, his breath catching as something wrong invaded the connection. Reek's eyes gleamed. Ah, so that's how deep it goes. Caleb barely heard him. He could feel Seris, but she was fading like something was trying to sever the bond forcibly. It wasn't supposed to be broken this way. If Reek succeeded, it wouldn't just erase their connection. It would destroy her. Something inside Caleb snapped. He didn't think. He just moved with a roar. He threw himself forward, tackling Reek away from Seris. The impact sent them both crashing to the ground. Reek twisted, swinging his weapon, but Caleb was faster. He grabbed the warlord's wrist and pushed, not physically but through the bond itself. A surge of energy erupted between them. Reek's expression flickered, confusion, then pain, before the force of the backlash sent him flying. He slammed into the far wall, his stolen energy dispersing. The pressure on Caleb's chest vanished. Seris gasped as the bond snapped back into place, whole again. Reek slumped against the stone, breathing heavily. His armor flickered, the energy destabilizing. He glared at them, but he knew it was over. Seris stood, her blade still at the ready, but Caleb could feel it. Reek wouldn't fight this battle anymore. The warlord pushed himself up, wiping blood from his mouth. He gave them one last look, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. Then he turned and disappeared into the shifting corridors, vanishing like a shadow. Caleb exhaled, his legs finally giving out beneath him. He barely registered Seris catching him, lowering him gently against the stone. His pulse was still erratic, his breath uneven. But the bond was stronger than ever. Seris pressed a hand against his cheek, her violet eyes searching his face. "You felt it, didn't you?" Caleb swallowed hard. Yeah, she didn't let go. Neither did he. They weren't just bound by accident anymore. They had chosen this. The temple was silent now, save for the steady hum of ancient energy settling into its new equilibrium. The walls no longer shifted. The sigils no longer pulsed with impending judgment. The trial was over, and they had passed. Caleb's breathing slowly evened out as he leaned into Seris' touch. He was still trying to process what had just happened, the raw force of the bond, the way he had felt her slipping away, and how instinct alone had driven him to pull her back. Not just instinct, choice. Seris exhaled, her forehead nearly touching his as she whispered, "You shouldn't have been able to do that." Caleb swallowed, feeling the remnants of whatever energy had surged through him still lingering beneath his skin. "And yet, I did." She pulled back slightly, studying him in that piercing way she always did, analyzing, calculating. But this time, there was something else beneath the scrutiny, something softer, a realization. Caleb felt it through the bond before she even spoke. "This connection," she murmured, her fingers still lightly curled around his. "It's not just a relic, it's not just something that happened to us." He nodded, his voice rough. "It's us." Seris' expression shifted just slightly, just enough. A crack in the walls she had built around herself. The way she looked at him now was different, not with resentment, not with resistance, with acceptance, with want. The air between them changed. It wasn't the same kind of tension they had shared before, the wary uncertainty, the reluctant partnership. This was something deeper, something inevitable. Caleb felt her pulse, the way it matched his own. Seris hesitated only for a moment longer. Then, as if surrendering to gravity itself, she closed the distance between them. Her lips met his and the bond ignited. It wasn't just a kiss. It was recognition. Every brush of her mouth against his sent a current through him. Every shift of her fingers in his hair set fire to the space between them. It was heat and weightlessness all at once, a connection deeper than anything he had ever known. Seris made a soft sound against his lips when he felt as much as heard. A part of her, a part of them both, had been fighting this. But now the fight was over. The temple had already made its judgment. They belonged to each other. When they finally broke apart, their foreheads rested together, breath mingling. Caleb's voice was quiet but certain. "We chose this." Seris closed her eyes for a long moment before whispering, "Yes." No hesitation, no regret. Yes, the bond was no longer just something they had to endure. It was something they had claimed as their own, and neither of them would ever walk alone again. The ruins of Sever 4 had gone silent, but the weight of what had just happened lingered in the air. Caleb could still feel Seris, not just beside him, but within him. The bond was no longer a chain, no longer something imposed on them. It was theirs. Seris exhaled against him, her forehead still lightly touching his. When she finally pulled back, her violet eyes held something different, something new. "We should go," she murmured. Caleb managed a half-smirk, though his chest still felt tight. "You mean after the near-death trial, forced spiritual awakening, and the warlord who wants us dead?" He pushed himself up. "Yeah, I'd say it's about time." Seris gave him a look that was almost amused. They moved quickly, retracing their steps toward the exit of the temple. The walls no longer shifted against them. Whatever the ruins had required, they had given it. As they reached the surface, the distant stars stretched out in the sky, endless and bright. But the moment was short-lived. Because waiting for them on the ridge above Reek's ship, Caleb tensed, his fingers already curling into fists, but Seris placed a hand on his arm before he could move. "No," she said softly. Reek stood at the entrance of his craft, his posture unreadable. He looked worse for wear, a gash along his jaw, his armor flickering from the temple's backlash. But his eyes still burned with a quiet kind of knowledge. "You surprised me," he admitted. "I didn't think you had it in you." Seris' stance didn't waver. "Whatever you came for, you failed. Leave." Reek exhaled, tilting his head slightly. "You misunderstand me." His gaze flickered to Caleb, assessing, calculating. "I was never after the ring itself. I was after the power it could awaken." Caleb's stomach twisted. Seris went rigid beside him. "What do you mean?" Reek smirked, but it wasn't mocking. It was knowing. "The bond you share is more than just connection. It's legacy. Something even you, Seris Aev'ryn, don't fully understand." Caleb's heart pounded. The temple, the shifting inscriptions, the way the bond had chosen him just as much as he had chosen it, it all clicked into place. He hadn't just been a random human caught in the crossfire. The ring had called to him. Reek stepped back onto his ship, his expression unreadable. "I'll be watching." "Because whether you want it or not, your story isn't over." The hatch closed, and before either of them could move, the ship launched into the sky, disappearing into the stars. A long silence stretched between them. Caleb finally let out a breath, running a hand down his face. "Well, that's not ominous at all." Seris didn't answer immediately. Instead, she turned to him, her expression softer than he'd ever seen it. "He's wrong about one thing," she said quietly. Caleb raised a brow. "Yeah," her fingers brushed against his. "Our story is ours, and we decide where it goes." Something warm settled in his chest. She was right. For the first time in his life, he wasn't running from something. He wasn't grasping for recognition or trying to prove himself to a world that had never felt like home. This, was something real. Caleb laced his fingers through hers, squeezing gently. "Then let's go write the next chapter." Seris' lips curved, just slightly, just enough. Then together they turned toward her ship, and without looking back they stepped into the future. The ship hummed beneath their feet as it lifted off from Sever 4, the weight of the temple, the trial, and everything they had endured fading into the void behind them. But Caleb knew, not all of it was left behind. He sat in the co-pilot's seat, watching the distant stars streak past the viewport. The bond between him and Seris wasn't just present. It was alive now, thrumming like a second heartbeat in his chest. He could feel her, not just in proximity, but in a way that no words could ever fully capture. And she could feel him too. Seris stood at the console, her hands resting lightly on the controls. But her focus wasn't on the navigation screen, it was on him. "You're quiet," she murmured. Caleb huffed a small laugh. "Just taking it all in." He gestured vaguely at the stars. "Never thought I'd end up here, in a spaceship, bonded to an alien warrior." His voice softened slightly, with no desire to change that. Sarah studied him for a moment, then slowly sat beside him. "Neither did I." The admission sent a ripple through him. For so long she had kept herself at a distance, duty-bound, unreadable, a force of purpose more than a person. But now he could see the change in her, feel it in the way she sat closer, in the way her defenses had finally, fully fallen. They had chosen each other. And there was no undoing it now. Caleb reached for her hand, turning it over in his palm, tracing the faint glow of the bond mark. It pulsed softly, mirroring the one on his own skin. "Whatever Reek meant," he said quietly, "whatever this bond actually is, I don't care." His fingers laced through hers. "Because it's ours now. Whatever comes next, we face it together." Seris held his gaze. No walls, no hesitation, just a quiet certainty that settled between them, warm and steady. She nodded. "Together." The ship hummed as it sailed through the vast unknown. Two souls no longer bound by fate, but by choice. And neither of them would ever walk alone again.